Welcome to an Alternate Hue. I'm Hugh Anderson, and let's get started with a little tidbit. With home prices at all-time highs and mortgage rates soaring to fresh two-decade highs, today's home buyer needs an income of $115,000 to afford a median-price home, assuming a 20% down payment. That's up from $99,000 just a year ago. That's only one of the reasons why home sales are challenged right now. Now here's another skunk at the climate cocktail party. A paper published by the Norwegian government statistical agency written by two of its retired experts recognized that the Earth is warming, but had the audacity to question whether CO2 is the cause. The authors ask a simple question. Are computerized climate simulations a sufficient basis for attributing observed warming to human CO2? After all, the Earth's climate has been subject to substantial warming and cooling trends for millennia, and that remain unexplained and can't be attributed to fossil fuels. As statisticians, their conclusion, quote, with the current level of knowledge, it seems impossible to determine how much of the temperature increase is due to emissions of CO2, unquote. The authors don't say climate models don't make useful predictions. Their predictions are useful precisely for testing the validity of climate models. But models are notorious for being a challenge. We use difficult to understand calculations based on annual average global temperature to validate these climate models, but these models gather inputs from disparate instruments and unstable sampling frequencies and a variety of proxies for times and places where no measurements were taken, and this fill-in-the-blanks approach is supposed to be unassailable. Before 2015, the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration reported that 2005 and 2010 were equally warm. By 2015, the record was changed to claim 2010 was warmer than 2005. Such adjustments are common. In 2017, independent researcher Marcia Wyatt showed 16 such revisions had been made to the long-past temperature record in just the previous 3 years. Critics contend that using the revised data to make hottest year and hottest month proclamations ignores its own stated margin of error, which is often a large multiple of the claimed temperature difference from one period to the next, meaning close enough for hand grenades. Now, the same week as the Norwegian paper, another was published from former NASA scientist James Hansen. And you're going to love this. Warming will be worse, his paper predicts, for an ironic reason. Our success in reducing particulate exhaust from vehicles and power sources has reduced the atmospheric aerosols that slow warming. Mr. Hansen champions nuclear power, which remains anathema to many Greens, quote unquote, and research into using aerosols artificially to cool the planet. Now you know. Now let's talk about the law of unintended consequences, or we're from the government and we're here to help. Now, of course, this is not the good old US of A, but I always get a chuckle when I read about different forms of government. In 1958, Chairman Mao, an environmentally and ecologically illiterate tyrant, launched the Great Sparrow Campaign, based on the preposterous idea that slaughtering birds would free up more food for the people. An all-out war ensued. Troops of agitated citizens, blowing into whistles, brandishing poles, and banging on kitchenware, hunted down terrified sparrows wherever they could find them. With millions of birds dead, locusts and other pests had their way with the rice harvest. Mao's sparrowcide contributed to the years of famine that followed, during which millions of Chinese perished. You don't mess with birds with impunity, and boy, Alfred Hitchcock would be proud. Now, demographer Neil Howe reports that the share of U.S. children living with married parents has fallen 14 percentage points since the 1980s. This decline is worsening already significant class divides between college-educated and non-college-educated Americans, according to the New York Times. A recent Times op-ed by economist Melissa Kearney, written in support of her new book, The Two-Parent Privilege, sparked a flood of responses debating whether children raised by married parents are really better off than those who aren't. In her book, Kearney is unequivocal. She marshals considerable evidence to show that two-parent families are more advantaged than single-parent households. On average, the children in two-parent homes tend to live in households with higher incomes, spend more time with their parents, do better in schools, and misbehave less, boys especially. A resource gap in childhood that carries over into better opportunities and greater educational attainment in adulthood. Now, this is healthcare enrollment time, and many of us are just thrilled with the year's premium increase, benefits reduction, and inaccessibility to our favorite physicians. Well, this is the latest graphical interpretation of just how messed up the U.S. healthcare system is and how much bang for the buck you're getting. Take a look. That's right. We keep spending more, and we keep getting less. And there are very other few parts of the U.S. economy where we as consumers put up with that for very long. The horizontal axis compared our healthcare spending per person to the vertical, which for what we get for the money. Now, speaking of money, take a look at the stock price of one of the largest healthcare providers in the country. The blue line that looks like a moonshot is compared to the broad stock market. There must be gold on their hills. Now, the folks at Hedgeye discussed a study that looked at the allocations of the largest financial advisory firms in the United States. This study spans some 40-plus years. The results were telling across the board. These firms adopted largely 60% stock and 40% bond allocation portfolios, otherwise known as balanced portfolios. And while there were firms that varied these allocations, the variations were rarely statistically significant. In effect, everybody followed the crowd. The result of this lack of boldness, quote unquote, in asset allocation was that performance across these firms was basically the same. When combined with associated fees, the outcome for the client was consistent underperformance over time. Now, Hedgeye contends that sticking with the crowd rarely excels, and Hightower Las Vegas agrees. Wandering far afield from the conventional investment mix is something to consider if you wish to grow wealth in a way that is not held hostage to the markets and their daily gyrations. Think about that. And if you take a look at our portfolios, the proof is in the pudding. Now, if you've noticed your neighbor spending a lot more time in the yard, this might be a reason why. This shows the unemployment rate for people unemployed for the last 15 weeks. And if you look in the lower right-hand corner, right next to that massive spike from COVID, you'll notice that things have gotten a little different since a year and a half ago. People are becoming more unemployed for longer. And that hasn't made the headlines yet. Now, Dave Rosenberg mentioned a new monthly poll conducted by the Financial Times and the University of Michigan's Ross School of Business that shows that 70% of American voters believe that President Biden's policies have either hurt the U.S. economy or had no impact at all. Only 14% believe they are better off financially since the time he got elected. Rosenberg contends that the debt-financed industrial subsidies to promote the construction boom in industrial facilities, basically the onshoring mentality, would only end up being mothballed. These subsidies led to a 60% year-over-year boom in the construction of manufacturing facilities at a time when manufacturing production is down 1%, aka they're building it, but they're not coming. 65% of consumers reported that they had started to curb their spending on things like vacations and restaurants, and 52% are even curtailing their expenditures on food and other everyday necessities. Now, Rosenberg contends he'll get more positive on market conditions when he sees a combination of lower stock prices and lower interest rates. A reversion to the mean would imply 3,300 on the S&P 500 and 3% on the 10-year U.S. Treasuries. That's roughly a 25% drop in the stock market and a 1.5% decline in the 10-year interest rate. Mean reversion. It's good for what ails you. And finally, lest I leave you in a bad mood, if you've ever felt like a failure, you're in very, very good company. Here you'll see all of the people, basically a rogues gallery of geniuses and people who have changed the world who didn't quite get it right the first time. Think about that the next time you're feeling low. More importantly, if you know a young person or a person who could use a little pick-me-up after a recent failure, let me know and I'll send you a copy of this chart. It's free for the asking. Well, that's it for this week. I'm happy to see you again. I promise I'm going to find more good news for us to share as the recession gathers steam. But until next time, this has been an Alternate Hue.